Good evening. This is Mae Brussell from Pacific Grove, California. This program emanates from KAZU-FM. Say wet California, and the radio towers, we've had trouble with them again, but I hope by next week things will be okay. This is broadcast number 586, and it's February the 28th, 1983. A few quick items I want to run down with you before I get into the larger subject. I want to discuss Mr. Bluhdorn, Charles Bluhdorn, Bluhdorn, this evening. The Soviet Union in Moscow has warned NBC to halt their stories linking the KGB to the shooting of the Pope. The Foreign Ministry has warned NBC to stop broadcasting those allegations about Bulgarian and Soviet involvement in the attempted assassination against the Pope, and Gene Randall, Moscow correspondent for NBC, said the warning was read to him Tuesday by the Foreign Ministry. They also disliked the lies and the links of KGB with a purported plot to kill Lech Walesa, the Polish labor leader. We'll do more, and I keep continuously updating the shooting of the Pope, the evidence of the role of the CIA in this past week. New information came in. The links to the Galen operation in Germany, which is actually where it all originated, and this is where the smoking gun, comes from. We'll do more next week, but I don't want to spend the time on this week's broadcast. There's a story in Covert Action. I don't know how many of you take that newsletter or the bulletin. Going back to April 1981, this was written, it was dated April 81, so it was written just prior to the shooting. It had to be prepared prior to the shooting of President Reagan in March of 81. It probably was written months before when it went to press. It's called The Spies and the Reagan Victory, The Right's Revenge by Fred Landis. And it is the story of the very team who is spreading this disinformation specifically for NBC, Marvin Kalb and Ray Cline, and the team that has the terror network, Claire Sterling, that had prepared a book. And actually, I'm sure the Claire Sterling research done by the CIA Disinformation and Propaganda Division was done, long research, and came out just at the time Ronald Reagan was shot and the Pope was shot. And then they could blame the Soviet Union and the Bulgarian and take total control of the intelligence agencies. Licio Gelli in Italy at that time, and Alexander Haig and his cohorts, William Casey and William Clark in the United States, could take control of our government simultaneously. This article mentions the book The Spike by Robert Moss and Arnaud de Borchgrave, Arnaud, small de, Borchgrave, if you don't know those ministers of propaganda. Claire Sterling and Robert Moss and de Borchgrave have become the ministers of propaganda when Ronald Reagan came into power, and they refer to this Mr. Cline, who also is written up in the Belarus Secret by John Loftus as part of the Nazi Wiesner Galen operation, a part of our intelligence community that worked with the Nazis that came into this country. The names in this story that was done a while back are very important because they are the exact people who are involved in this disinformation on the shooting of the Pope. Ray Cline, he's an example of the propagandist, and Michael Ledeen. There's a photograph of Michael Ledeen who tried to portray Billy Carter as a Soviet-backed Libyan agent and so forth. These names should be familiar to you of Ray Cline and Michael Ledeen and de Borchgrave and Moss. If you don't have the story, I'll make copies for you. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope. It's 6 pages, so it'd be 3 pages back to back, approximately $1 for the printing. Self-addressed stamped long envelope, the legal size. And I'll get this to you because it was written in 1981, and 2 years later, in 1983, the stepped-up propaganda and the lies that the Soviet Union are complaining about, every person involved in that script is involved in the propaganda now of the Bulgarian connections. And I want to do a great link, the chronology of this team and the propaganda and how it developed and where it's going. So if you want to send for this, I'll have a copy for you. Many of you take the magazine. If you have it, look back to 1981, and it has the team that Moscow is complaining about our disinformation, and they have ordered them to halt the propaganda. February 22nd, this last week, the Associated Press story, the Army plans to expand the Green Berets. Ronald Reagan is going to extend the Special Forces that at one time was 11,500 men. The move, according to this news story, coincides with a secret guidance paper that has been circulated among the armed services that calls for their bolstered ability, in quotes, to disrupt the enemy rear in area operations in Eastern Europe. They're planning World War III. They're very open about it. They said that they have to work within the Warsaw Pact and Eastern Europe, and the Berets have to have the increased operations command at Fort Bragg, and they're going to add to the size Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Remember the broadcaster, maybe you don't, number 577, that was December 27th, just several months ago. And I gave the origin of the Special Forces, which I've updated from time to time, the role of John J. McCloy, who I just recently, last week and the week before, detailed some of his life and biography and worked with the Nazis. It was McCloy who worked with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence, and Otto Skorzeny in setting up the Special Forces pattern after Adolf Hitler's commandos and the SS, and Dr. Alfred Franz, F-R-A-N-Z, Alfred Six, S-I-X, of the SS with Reinhard Gehlen, came to this country, or assisted, he actually didn't travel here, but he assisted with McCloy and Gehlen, who was in this country, and Otto Skorzeny, and set up these special forces. Well, now their goal is coming true, and they're going to be behind the eastern lines, and they'll just about get the war they wanted. Also, last week, the report came out about the Japanese internment in California during World War II, and the opinion of the Congressional Committee in 1983 was that rounding up 120,000 Japanese was the result of, in quotes, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Now, the same people, John McCloy, our advisors, Earl Warren's gone, and Mr. Secretary of War Henry Stimson is gone, but John McCloy is still alive. And that mentality, Stimson had handpinned McCloy, and his name is in these articles, as well as McCloy, who was to supervise the camps and did a bad job of it. That race prejudice was the same factor that in 1941, when they rounded up these people, that combined with Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, and the Nazis as a continuous activity before and after the war. The failure of political leadership is what you have today, increasing the special forces, sending extra aid and army to get us into the El Salvadorian conflict to make sure that the right side wins no matter what happens to the native population, and military necessity means that the individual doesn't count. It's business as usual. Nothing has changed. Race prejudice, political leadership, and military necessity are all failures. They called it failure then, they're a failure now. And when they fail at one thing, they never fall away or die. If we fail in the Vietnam War, Henry Kissinger goes on to advise the Middle East or Central America or South America to order the murder of Allende in South America and Chile. These people are permanent. They're locked in, whether it's Henry Stimson or John McCloy or Henry Kissinger or Fritz Kramer. When we make a bad move, such as putting the military junta into Greece, they're never fired or removed. They're promoted and sent to other countries to cause pain somewhere else. The Charles Lindbergh case is being opened up again. I won't detail that now, but I will go in the future into the parallels between that and the various conspiracies and planted evidence and disinformation that's gone through the years. But it is opening up in New Jersey, and I think I'd want to mention it because Anna Hauptmann, the widow of Bruno Hauptmann, charged with murdering the Lindbergh child, is 84. She has one goal, that's to clear her husband's name before she dies. And again, it goes back to a man from Germany who left some money in the garage of Hoffman and went to Germany. Germans were involved with the Alger Hiss case with Whittaker Chambers. The Germans were involved with the Lindbergh case, and it goes back again to Germany and the United States military. This case is opening up, and an attorney from San Francisco is helping her, a person who's put in $70,000 of his own money, attorney Robert Bryan from San Francisco. So we'll do more on that later. Also, the two candidates in Germany for presidency right now, Helmut Kohl, K-O-H-L, and Mr. Vogel. His name is Hans, H-A-N-S-J-O-C-H-E-N, Vogel, V-O-G-E-L. Both belong to Hitler's youth. Thanks to John McCloy, all German politicians who are Nazis were allowed to run the government afterwards. In fact, anyone who wasn't, who opposed the Nazis, was killed and moved out of the way, so that all you have are Hitler, Hitler Youth, and Nazis running that country since World War II. The only thing missing is the armband and the legs marching. Another news story about Klaus Barbie, I'll do more on him later, how he visited the United States. He was in New Orleans in the early 60s and 70s. He was in Houston and Galveston. In New Orleans, I'm sure he was at the International Trade Mart with Clay Shaw, part of the Galen operation, who had a role in the assassination of John Kennedy. And Houston is the headquarters for the CIA foundations, the Anderson Foundation for Leon Jaworski, CIA Foundation, the Black Money, the Kill Money, the Brown and Root that George de Mohrenschildt worked for, another Nazi war spy, alleged to be a spy during World War II, the conduit for Lee Harvey Oswald's introductions through the Dallas-Fort Worth area and planting him in strategic locations. Klaus Barbie not only visited the United States, but as I mentioned before, Joseph Mengele's was in Arizona, California, and then Life magazine came out with the stories in New Jersey. An interesting person died, a new name to me, but I want to share it with you and get it on the tapes for the record. I don't think he was murdered, but he's an important person. His name is Alan S. Rupley, R-U-P-L-E-Y, from W.R. Grace & Company, Associated Press story. He served 5 years as chairman of W.R. Grace and was head of the Grace Foundation. Originally, the Grace Company was a shipping company and boats in Latin America, extensive ties from the time of World War 1917 in Chile, Bolivia, Central America. I haven't been able to find the book, The Pirate of Peru. This is the story how the Grace shipping line raped and emptied out the wealth of Peru. But this man was the person who arranged the Grace investment, the shipping company, into the chemical industry. Now that is a marriage broker, if I ever heard of one, because the shipping company of Grace during World War I was the shipping agency when Adolf Hitler, during the war and even during World War II, but long prior to World War II in the 30s, was sending and supplying and making strong contacts with the Central and South American countries, particularly the South American countries, where it was important to have bases in Bolivia and Argentina, Brazil, and so forth, Paraguay, Uruguay, and so forth, so that the Grace would be an important factor in the role of Adolf Hitler's German people, and they have the shipping lines down there. But after they have the shipping lines going, this Alan Rupley was the man who first introduced them to the chemical industry. Now, the obituary I have doesn't say it was I.G. Farben. What happened was that J. Peter Grace's family, and he's a member of the Reagan Board to cut costs, domestic costs in America, married into the I.G. Farben network, which was the large chemical company, and Otto Ambros, who designed Zyklon B for extermination, the gases at Auschwitz and other places. He became a partner, Otto Ambros, with J. Peter Grace, and they grew to be the 5th largest chemical company in the United States, which is an extension then, if it's the 5th largest in the United States, of I.G. Farben. It became married to and partnership with I.G. Farben. So you had the chemicals and you had the boats shipping them back and forth. You had the intent for genocide, extermination, and this fellow, Alan S. Rupley, was the man who introduced the chemical industry into the Grace shipping line and made it what it is today. Another article in a short page, it's not a whole article, but short paragraphs about the CIA infiltrating the American system, because when I talk about the Odessa, I mean it is into the American system in every way and form. Counterspy, this last month, February '83, has 3 organizations coming out of the University of Illinois in Chicago. One of them is called the APSA, the American Political Science Association, funded the CIA as a contract to develop a way to have models of governing the world on a global basis. The article says, guess who's studying how to govern the world? The CIA. Well, if you're not worried about Otto Skorzeny's heritage or Reinhard Gehlen's heritage or the Nazis who have manipulated the CIA, then forget this article. But this is Hitler's Fourth Reich. It moved to the United States, and so that the University of Illinois has a study on how to govern the entire world. Okay? Then there's another group out of the University of Illinois called the CFP, the Congressional Fellowship Program. It's run by the CIA, Robin Schreiber, S-C-H-R-E-I-B-E-R, of the CIA, to have candidates for the assistance to congressional aides to congressmen and to congressional committees, like the House Select Committee on Assassinations or any investigation of pollution or chemicals or any congressional aides or special committees. They train. The CIA has a training staff to serve professional staff assistants for members of Congress and congressional committees. So if somebody says you don't like something, write to your congressman. How does the congressman hire these people? He has a pool of labor. He moves to Washington from 50 different states. He has a list of people to get, and all of them can be trained by the CIA. So when you complain, they can make a dossier on you, because every congressman you write to in every committee investigating the crimes of the Central Intelligence Agency is run by the CIA. And then they have a third group that is called the CSI, the Consortium for the Study of Intelligence, formed by William Casey and Ray Cline and Roy Goodson of Georgetown University. Ray Cline, again, working with Frank Wiesner and bringing the Nazis to this country from that Belarusia area, just one alone, but part of the disinformation and propaganda, the fellow written up by John Landis in the Disinformation and the CIA Group. This is William Casey and Ray Cline and Roy Goodson from Georgetown telling the universities, going around and lecturing to the role of intelligence in a free society, where they brought in Galen, who immediately after the war wanted to starve 40 million and turn 50 million into slaves. Those are the people these people worked with, and they want to propagandize the university so that there's 3 study groups funded by American tax dollars on how to make yourself slaves. Very important. Now, I want to, at length, the rest of this broadcast, go into, again, the Odessa. How do you recognize the Odessa? And Mr. Charles Bluhdorn of Gulf and Western, and a interesting scenario coming out of his life that ended last week. The Boston Globe had an editorial February the 12th apropos of this subject, and very much Mae Brussell, and I'm wondering why it hasn't come out for 15 or 20 years, but let's say better late than never. The Boston Globe editorial is February the 12th. Says a fascist has returned, and it refers to Klaus Barbie, who tortured people himself and whipped and clubbed them and poured boiling water on them and sent the children to death camps. He's now in France, and this editorial is about the unspeakable crimes that he did. Under the name, they were paid and protected so they could be active in an anti-communist crusade, which the Fuhrer wanted, that was temporarily interrupted. This Fourth Reich was interrupted, but they wanted an anti-communist crusade so that anybody who whipped or tortured or sent thousands or millions to their death was okay, as long as they didn't like communists. Their names, along with Klaus Barbie, compose a rogues gallery of fascist thuggery. Hitler's master spy, Reinhard Gehlen, was made chief of the West German intelligence agency, the BND, after the war, and shared his Nazi intelligence data with his protectors in the CIA. The mistake here is that he formed the CIA, but they said he shared it with the CIA. The CIA, the OSS, became the CIA, and Gehlen then went back to head the BND. But that's okay. We'll give them an error right there for a little while. Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi specialist at organizing terror networks in occupied countries, was employed in the U.S. Army's Historical Division, which served as a way station for former Nazis who could go on and serve the Gehlen CIA network. This is the Boston Globe editorial telling you the role of Otto Skorzeny in the United States Army's Historical Division. That's why you never heard of Fritz Kramer before. Skorzeny used his immunity, thanks to John McCloy and others, Chase Manhattan Bank and the multinationals, ITT and General Motors and Ford Motor Company, etc. He used his immunity to shepherd his Nazi comrades out of Europe through their cover organization known as the Odessa and Die Spine, D-I-E-S-P-I-N-N-E. It's 2 words. Die Spine is the spider. That's what I drew that network for you. And those of you that listen to the broadcast on the air, I got about 70 letters last week asking me to send you that diagram and chart, and the subscribers get it automatically in the mail. And I'll get more printed and more out to answer the rest of the mail this week. The editorial says, as the years went by, Gehlen and Skorzeny and their network of old boy collaborators accumulated enormous influence in Europe and Latin America. Now you have to remember, the America is a partnership with them right now. Scorzeni shuttled between Franco's Spain and Perón's Argentina, where he served the Argentine dictator as a gray eminence. His goal was to foster the growth of the fascist Fourth Reich with their centers in Latin America. He could count on his loyalists, such as Joseph Mengele in Paraguay, again, who's visited the United States and worked with the United States government in the energy department with Arnaud Ambrose. They didn't say that. He worked with Adolf Eichmann and Hans Ulrich Rudel, R-U-D-E-L, in Argentina, Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F, in Chile, and Klaus Barbie in Bolivia. Rauff is charged with sending 97,000 Jews to their death, served as a revered advisor to the fascist dictatorship in Chile of Augusto Pinochet, P-I-N-O-C-H-E-T, the president of Chile at the present time, and helped with the overthrow of Salvador Allende and set up the notorious police known as the DINA, D-I-N-A. Barbie in Bolivia organized paramilitary death squads and drug smuggling networks for a succession of military regimes. Drug smuggling networks, the CIA, the Nazis, and Henry Kissinger gave the orders to kill Allende and put Pinochet in power. I still believe that he is the deepest cover Nazi spy, and that Jew is a cover for the work of Henry Kissinger. He's put in these Nazis in every country that he's touched or had influence, but the dumb Jews are so dumb that they want to believe, that Henry Kissinger is one of them while he's putting the Nazis in the United States and in Europe. But this editorial recognizes the role and the marriage, what I called that relationship that was formed, that I first put in my first published article in 1972. It's good to have it in 1983 in the Boston Globe, and they can go a little further, but that's a lot of mileage for the Boston Globe at this point, so we have to say bravo. But they understand now that these people were used for the Fourth Reich, that they are alive, Mengele and Rauff and so forth, and Klaus Barbie, and the approximately 130,000 Nazi criminals in the United States, and thousands and thousands hundreds of thousands went to South America, China, Central America, Asia, all over the world, and South Africa. So that they are breeding and multiplying and funded with the endless funds of the United States Defense Intelligence Agency. In addition to the Defense Department funding, gun running and narcotics is the way that they buy the weapons and the propaganda and continue the death squads and paying for the killings. Now on to Charles G. Bluhdorn, B-L-U-H-D-O-R-N, died last week, president of Gulf and Western. A very interesting and complex career, and I'll try to make it as simple as I can in this hour, remaining half hour, and continue discussing him probably next week and for weeks to come, because he isn't a simple person. His corporation is a complex organization that was under investigation many, many times for many years and should have been exposed, and the quiet biography or the obituary shouts out for more explanations to the American people about who this man was. He came from Vienna during the war in 1942. Now, everybody who came from Europe at that time was not going to be used as a spy network or as part of the Odessa, but I think we have to begin to examine people like the Henry Kissinger family, the Fritz Kramers, the Peter Druckers, the Charles Bluhdorns, because where their career goes after they came here, not the fact that they came here during World War II, but where did they go afterwards? He came here to this country. He attended university in New York City, City College, not the university. Then he went to Columbia. He didn't graduate. Out of Columbia came the presidency. Eisenhower, after the war, was made president, and Mr. Brzezinski, and a large conduit also of disinformation and Pentagon support for policies came out of Harvard University and out of Columbia simultaneously. He served a time in the United States Air Force. I don't know what years those were, but they said he was in the Air Force and Army Air Force and also attending these colleges but didn't graduate. He did pretty well for somebody who didn't graduate. He was in the cotton business in New York City, the brokerage Cotton House. Started at $15 a week working in New York, began his career in 1947-48. The CIA was formed in 47. I'll do an overlay along with his biography. By 1949, he formed the Export-Import concern. By the age of 30, he was already a millionaire. Export-Import is a cover for espionage, intelligence, and the setting up of the Fourth Reich after the war. It was a big operation called Export-Import, in fact, Otto von Bolschwing. When he came to this country, the head of Gehlen, Germany's Reinhard Gehlen, and our CIA, our organization, known after the OSS as the CIA, his first role was in the export-import business, and then goes on with the top business moguls, the multinational Defense Department people traveling all over the world. Where Mr. Bluhdorn, B-L-U-H-A-D-O-R-N, I keep spelling this so that we get it right, Bluhdorn, went into the import-export at age 30. He had his million. Mr. Bluhdorn then to Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1956, where he acquired a small auto parts distributorship. Grand Rapids, Michigan is the location of Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company. General Motors is a conduit for the CIA and the intelligence. By 1956, they were very much involved in that for the United States government. Ford Motor Company and General Motors were building for Adolf Hitler, for the fascists in Europe, for France and for Spain and for Germany or Italy, factories going before the war, during the war, and after the war. He leaves the stock market in New York City or the export-import, Mr. Bluhdorn, to go in 1956 to a small auto parts distributorship in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Then he goes down to Houston, Texas 2 years later. Now, Houston is, you can't say the whole city's involved in spying, that's ridiculous, but this is the location of the CIA foundations exposed in the New York Times and books later, the Leon Jaworski, the Anderson Foundation, John Connolly, the CIA foundations, the kill money for the CIA, the Brown and Root organization. Down in Houston is a network of funding for the operations around the world of the Central Intelligence Agency. John Connolly was part of Permindex that came out of Italy. And we have Mr. Bluhdorn working with Michael Sindona, God's banker. A few years later, he goes down to Houston at another auto parts distributorship and then forms what is known as Gulf and Western. It's hard to believe how profitable these little auto parts distributors are, but he grows up to be this multinational corporation. In 1966, he forms, as head of the Gulf and Western, a new company that he incorporates. It's in New Jersey, the Zinc Company. Goodness knows how big it is or what it was. So he's covering the Wall Street area with a cotton brokerage firm, the export-import, which is international. He's up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with a car parts. Then he's down in Houston, Texas, where the hub of activity between the espionage operations of what I call the Fourth Reich between Michigan and Houston, and then Gulf and Western extends to a zinc company in New Jersey, and then buys Paramount Pictures in 1967 in Hollywood, California. By 1970, Michael Sindona has come to the United States as God's banker from the Vatican to invest Vatican money into the United States and parlay the Vatican fortune into the American corporations. They built the Watergate Hotel, and Michael Sindona buys from Mr. Bluhdorn 50% of Paramount Studio in Hollywood and the real estate all around it. In return, Mr. Bluhdorn props up the Franklin National Bank that's collapsing by putting Gulf and Western money into the bank that eventually lost $45 million, but he takes it from Gulf and Western to help his friend Michael Sindona. So in addition to coming to this country during the war in 1942 from Vienna, he is, by 1970, directly working with the Vatican and Michael Sindona in business investments in the United States, transferring work from the New York Stock Exchange, as I say, to Houston, Texas, to Grand Rapids, Michigan, from New Jersey to Hollywood, New York, with Michael Sindona. I'll now take a 1-minute break on this broadcast and return with you to continue more on Mr. Bluhdorn and the American intelligence establishment. Brussels, it's the second half of the broadcast number 586, February 28, 1983, emanating from KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. Seymour Hersh wrote a series of articles on Gulf and Western in 1976-77, one from July 26, 1977 on the Gulf and Western for the New York Times. He described how they purchased the Simon & Schuster publishers. Those were the men, as I say, who did Madison, All the President's Men and The Final Days, and then purchased the Madison Square Garden. I went on to purchase that and many other corporations. By 1970, Gulf and Western was not the successful organization or corporation that it turned out to be when Mr. Charles Bluhdorn passed away. Is high up in the Fortune 500, this current analysis or study of the profitable corporations. It was losing money, so it made a three-way financial package because these selected corporations, I don't believe, would be allowed to go broke, so they manipulate their funds and merge. One was with the Commonwealth United, written up in the New York Times, and they gave $12 million in cash, and in turn Gulf and Western got Commonwealth United stock, face value $30 million. In August of 1970, their debts went into default, but at that point he acquired 15 million shares of Societe Generale Immobiliare. That's the Italian bank of Michael Sindona. Societe, S-O-C-I-E-T-A, Generale, pronounced that way, Generale, Immobiliare, I-M-M-O-B-I-L-A-I-R-E, SGI is the short for the corporation. It's an Italian real estate company, and Michael Sindona controlled that bank, and in turn, that's when Sindona picked up 50% interest in Gulf and Western, in Paramount Pictures, and the surrounding real estate in Hollywood. The Gulf and Western was inflated real estate. It was sold at inflated price. They split that, as I say, the studio together with the Vatican Bank, and then purchased and parlayed farmlands in Florida, and then purchased land on Martinique, an island from Baron Edmond de Rothschild. The agent for the sale was somebody from Israel, not named. Gulf and Western was involved with the security exchange problems. If you want to look those up, this is written by Jeff Gerth, the great New York Times writer, along with Seymour Hersh on organized crime syndicates. This is August the 21st, 1979. A series of articles were sent to me by a World Watcher couple in New York City who've done magnificent work in keeping me up on some of the older articles I missed and current articles that are going on now. The Security Exchange said the Gulf and Western and its chairman, Charles G. Bluhdorn, violated federal securities law. They engaged in repeated financial manipulations to overstate the company's profits. They artificially inflated the value of the company's security. They withheld more than $38 million allegedly owed to the government of the Dominican Republic. And the new president of the Dominican Republic, Antonio Guzman, G-U-Z-M-A-N, the fellow I said died just a few months before Mr. Bluhdorn with a bullet in his head. The New York Times article was saying in 1979 that Mr. Bluhdorn made secret deals with the former Dominican Republic officials in speculating in sugar futures and didn't deliver 38.7 million share of the profits belonging to the country. It's like the Grace family raping Peru, the pirates of Peru. There was $38.7 million that belonged to the country that wasn't there in the Security Exchange when it linked into the sugar sales and the company dealings in the Dominican Republic, and claimed that there was a $2 million lawsuit against Gulf and Western, charging them with sabotaging a hotel project in the Dominican Republic, and a suit in connection with the 1974 bankruptcy of the Bohawk Corporation that Mr. Bluhdorn testified falsely under oath, and that Gulf and Western was involved with fraud in connection with the company in trying to take over the Atlantic and Pacific, that's the tea company, the grocery store. There was a long lawsuit going on for 3 years involving Gulf and Western and the A&P and the sugar and the hotel deals and so forth. Another article in the New York Times, 1979, November 27, 1979, the Security Exchange Commission, after 3.5-year investigation of Gulf and Western and its chairman, Charles G. Bluhdorn, with improper financial reports and other fraudulent courses of conduct, and they were named as defendants in a case for these investigations into utilizing Gulf and Western for personal, tax, legal, and financial services. And Mr. Bluhdorn performed a valuable service for Michael Sindona, the Italian financier, by putting proceeds from a complex stock transaction into the holding company of the Franklin National Bank, from which Mr. Sindona controlled, in an attempt to artificially support the market price of the Franklin Bank. I mention this because this company, Gulf and Western, is deeply involved with the Vatican, with espionage, with fraudulent manipulation of money, money missing, at the same time acquiring and consuming more and more corporations until it becomes so big and donates so much to the city that nobody is ever prosecuted, and the whole thing is covered up with icing on a cake. The New York Times in 1979 said Gulf and Western failed to report how Mr. Bluhdorn used $64 million in profits from the company made speculating in sugar future markets in 1975, or how this money was used in the Dominican Republic. Now, this is very important because on other broadcasts, and I keep bringing up the missing millions of dollars and billions of dollars. It literally goes into billions, but there's hunks of money of these people from suspicious circumstances, coming from Vienna particularly, and links to the Vatican, to the shenanigans of these missing monies. Recently, you've been reading about the Environmental Protection Agency and the huge mass of money, I'll do more on later broadcasts, that they cannot account for, $50 million. Then the cost overrun of John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy that I spoke of another $50 million, or cost overruns that they can't account for, of $50 million. And so that there's $50 million here, $50 million there, another $45 million from the Franklin Bank, $64 million in profits in 1979 that they will not account for. Now, is this going into what I diagrammed for you as the Odessa? One branch of the Odessa is they work with the Nazis, and these people work closely with them, work with the Vatican, have the missing money. 1979, the New York Times had this story. And again, I mentioned Los Angeles Times, if you want to look it up for your researchers, and it's on the slip of paper that accompanies the tape. July the 5th, 1982, the Dominican president dead in an apparent suicide. He left no suicide note. Antonio Guzman, the man who worked with Mr. Bluhdorn at a time that the Vatican is being exposed, who's a partner with Michael Sindona when Roberta Calvi has been hung in June, when Edwin Wilson is coming home with literally the smoking gun that Ajah had to shoot the Pope through the Edwin Wilson Turple CIA Galen connections. Wilson thinks that he'll get immunity in the Dominican Republic. He's brought to the United States instead, so Edwin Wilson is locked up, a major conduit of these funds and shenanigans and spying. He's locked up in the United States. The Dominican president is dead 2 weeks later. Roberta Calvi is dead in June 18th. In July 5th, the president, Guzman, who worked with Mr. Bluhdorn, is dead by a gunshot in the Dominican, and by February, this last Monday, Mr. Bluhdorn himself, 56 years old, is dead. Now, another story from the New York Times, Seymour Hersh, June 29, 1976, about Sidney Korshak. And this is important because he's an attorney who combines that merger that Gulf and Western is going to have between Music Corporation of America, between Gulf and Western and Kirk Kerkorian. And in 1976, there was a story in the New York Times that goes this way. In October 73, three of the most prosperous businessmen in America, each the chief executive of a major public corporation, concluded a complex real estate and film leasing transaction. The business partners were Charles G. Bluhdorn of Gulf and Western Industries, a conglomerate with more than $3 billion in assets, Lou Wasserman of Music Corporation of America, the entertainment conglomerate, who is considered the most competent executive in Hollywood, and Kirk Kerkorian of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a financier whose personal fortune is estimated at more than $50 million. The mediator in the negotiation between MGM, Music Corporation, and Bluhdorn from Vienna is Sidney Korshak, a lawyer and labor consultant who began his career as a lawyer representing Al Capone's gang, the Capone mob in Chicago. Those were his underworld connections. Now, out of Cicero, Illinois, and the Capone gang was Paul Marcinkus, the banker, who went from Cicero, Illinois into the CIA branch of the Vatican as the head of the Vatican Bank, who hides there now and can't leave there because he'd be arrested for his shenanigans. He worked with the mob. He worked with Michael Sindona closely, Roberta Calvi, Alessio Gelli, and the fascists. He came out of Cicero, Illinois, and a fellow attorney from that same Cicero, Illinois, and the Capone gang that Marcinkus came from becomes the attorney for this three-way merger of Gulf and Western, MGM that recently put Alexander Haig on the board, and Music Corporation of America. Now, the Music Corporation of America had another character that they brought in through Bill Meiklejohn. I had him on a broadcast about a year and a half ago. I talked about it. They brought Ronald Reagan from Des Moines, Iowa in 1937 to Hollywood. Those were the years prior to the invasion of Poland. Those were the years where Errol Flynn was being recruited into the Gestapo as part of the Gestapo. In 1940 and 42, Errol Flynn was making his movies there at Warner Brothers with Ronald Reagan. Reagan was brought out of Des Moines, Iowa as a broadcaster for the Chicago Cubs, and out of Chicago, again, the Chicago Korshak Marcinkus hub, out of there, moved to California on the MGM lot by Bill Meiklejohn, Meiklejohn. If some of you don't have my tapes on that, he was immediately given $200 a week in a contract. It's important to keep going back to Ronald Reagan's career, not only because he worked with members of the Gestapo then, but the Music Corporation of America that decided to have the sports announcer move out to Warner Brothers from Chicago and Iowa. This same corporation is linking in with Gulf and Western, founded by a man from Vienna who works with Michael Sindona and the Vatican, and Sindona was very active in the Richard Nixon administration in promoting that administration and funding through Maurice Stans and William Casey, allegedly $1 million, but goodness knows what else, as well as, I say, building the Watergate Hotel that brought Nixon out and put Vicar Haig into a key spot. And also they created Henry Kissinger's career through the Nixon administration as the international figure. So the Music Corporation had a hand in the Ronald Reagan career, and then at Ronald Reagan's inauguration is Alessio Gelli. And not only is Ronald Reagan brought out by this corporation that ties in with Gulf and Weston and Kerkorian, which in itself no single thing is important, but the minute he's the governor in California comes Helene vonDamm from Vienna, brought in by William Casey of counterintelligence, part of the Galen operation, into Chicago, where she worked in an insurance office up in Detroit, Michigan, like Gulf and Western up in Grand Rapids and Detroit. First up there, then a secretary in Chicago, out of this hub of the Chicago network into California, put by William Casey and William Clark, rather. It was William Clark who was in counterintelligence, who brought her literally from Vienna. William Clark, our famous head of the National Security Council. She became Ronald Reagan's secretary for 8 years, and now is has made appointments for 2.5 years in Washington, and is now our ambassador to Vienna. So Reagan's career overlaps these people in every sense of the word. The cities, the people, and Music Corporation, through Mr. Meiklejohn, brought him out from Chicago and from Des Moines immediately on his salary, and he goes on then to become the head of the Screen Actors Guild, the board, and the rest of his career you can fill in a lot of those pieces if you want. December the 17th, 1977, New York Times, Gerald Eskenazi has an article about Sonny Werblin. David Abraham Sonny Werblin became promoted as the head of the Madison Square Garden. It was owned by Mr. Bluhdorn. He bought the Madison Square Garden, the Bluhdorn Corporation, Gulf and Western, and then they had a inauguration or a coming out party to announce that Sonny Werblin, a flamboyant, successful promoter of sports, of horse racing and entertainment in the United States, would become president of the Madison Square Garden and be charged of the activities there. He was the president of MCA, Music Corporation of America TV, secretary to the Mammoth Park Racetrack in New Jersey. You can imagine what kind of a gang that was. The president of New York Jets, head of the Elburn Farm Racing Stables, chairman of the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority. So Gulf and Western brought him from Music Corporation, where he was the president, in 1951, and that was the corporation that set up Ronald Reagan in 1937. Werblin also is the agent for Johnny Carson, negotiating the NBC contract, the multi-million-dollar contract with NBC. And of course, NBC has been fingered as the propaganda disinformation for the Cold War tactics of the Michael Ledeen, Michael Alexander Haig, Licio Gelli conduit of lies against the Cold War lies against who really shot the Pope. Now, this appointment as the head of Madison Square Garden was important, and as I say, he was the head of Music Corporation TV in 51, and Music Corporation was behind as early as 37 the Ronald Reagan career. The Washington Post has a story, February the 8th, 1981. There was an article about Sonny Werblin and how he likes to get together with his old friend Ronald Reagan in the old days. He goes back to the old days when he was the agent for the sports figure. Ronald Reagan was brought out there. One was carrying on sports and sport activity, and here was this sport announcer brought from Des Moines, Iowa, and Chicago to Hollywood, very much linked to sports, horse racing, and so forth. This Sonny Werblin had a big part in the early career of Ronald Reagan. He now works for the Gulf and Western. Music Corporation merges in other ways, so that they not only have a three-way merger in October 73 of this gang, but they have a link in the Madison Square Garden that goes back to the early Ronald Reagan career. We'll do more. I'm going to talk about some of the Bormann money, or where does the money come, or how do these corporations grow? Do they just grow like Topsy? And before I do that, I want to refer you to a broadcast I had February 1982, February 14th. That was just a year ago. Broadcast number 532 on the Air Florida crash, on Neil Bourke and his role with Kirk Kerkorian and the Western Airlines and MGM. And I mentioned the book Kirk Kerkorian, The American Success Story by Dial Torgerson, Torgerson, put out in Dial Press in 1974. And this book tells you what a great success he was and how he built himself up from nothing and bought MGM Studio under the help of Edgar Bronfman. That was the Permandex Corporation. Again, the Michael Sandonia, Licio Gelli, the Italian assassination team of Nazis during the war with multinational corporations in America with headquarters also in Houston, Texas, and in Canada. Kerkorian working with Edgar Bronfman of Permandex and MGM, and Greg Boutzer, who was the attorney for Howard Hughes. And this book tells how when Kirk Kerkorian wanted to buy MGM, a studio formerly owned by Louis Mayer, he goes to Germany to Otto Schoepler, Schoeppler, from Bankhaus Burkhardt, Bankhaus Burkhardt and Company in West Germany, and they gave him $50 million to purchase MGM. Now, I know that we call these people self-made or ingenious, but Kerkorian can go to Germany and pick up $50 million and plunk it down and get a studio. And along those lines, and the week before, talking about Neil Bourke in connection with the Western Airlines and the MGM studios. And this is important because MGM becomes a three-way partner with Mr. Bluhdorn, born in Vienna, who's come to this country during the war in 1942 and then accumulates this massive fortune and is involved in the Dominican Republic heavily, which was overthrown by the CIA, and Richard Nixon is the attorney for that family, had a heavy role with the Trio family. So these things are not separated. And I mentioned Neil Bourke, who became chairman of Western Airlines and is the president chairman today, who bought into Alaska International Air in Wien, Alaska, and how he took 1 year off in April 1980 and went on a yacht to South Africa and so forth and came back with $50 million to buy Wien Air Alaska. Now, one goes to Europe and picks up the money and buys an airline that later is funding the transport planes that are illegal to send to Gaddafi, are getting over to Gaddafi via these very airlines, And the money was picked up originally in Germany, $50 million for one airline, Wien Air, and he comes down to become a partner in Western Airlines with Kirk Kerkorian, and Kerkorian goes to Germany and picks up another $50 million, and we sometimes have to repeat, as I say, those are broadcast 532 and 531, those were February 1982. Hunks of money picked up in Germany, and I'm asking the question because like 46 million is gone out of Dominican Republic, and more of that was gone earlier, millions, up to $1 billion. Who is handling this money, and how would you recognize the Odessa? That's the chart that I had with broadcast number 585, the branches of the Odessa. How would you recognize where this money is coming from and where it is going and how it's being parlayed, say, into narcotics and activities, while at the same time those very people like Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford on the board of 20th Century Fox, Alexander Haig on the board of MGM, the Vatican, 50% ownership of Michael Sindona with Paramount Studio, with Gulf and Western. How would you know that every conduit of radio, TV, and movie will be controlled and is controlled by this overseas money, or hunks of it, coming in from these unknown sources, just like a 50% owner of 20th Century Fox? This Mr. Rich is under investigation for $27 million over in Swiss banks that isn't accounted for. He bought 50% of the Fox studio, and his Netherlands investigations, the source of funds coming in the Netherlands, is under question and investigation linked again to Rockefeller and Chase Manhattan, that originally was involved in the conduit of bringing the Nazis to this country. These people are not separate entities. They all relate to each other with these floating funds, and the funds appear in various articles that I try to collect. Now, I referred several years ago to the book The Forces of Power by William Taub, but I want to repeat it now because the way the money moves, and because we're talking about the Dominican Republic, this is a book that was put out by Grosset and Dunlap, 1979. It's a must if you don't have it. In this book, it tells about, this is the one that tells how Richard Nixon moves the law office of Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander in New York, as I said before, takes up an office in the apartment. The firm is buying Mr. Nixon an apartment at 812 Fifth Avenue, and that is the building, 812 Fifth Avenue, of Nelson Rockefeller, who is the conduit of Frank Wiesner, and Richard Nixon, and the CIA, and the Belarusian Nazis, who are going to bring you the production of World War III. Nixon has associations in Spain, Taub tells you, which we know are Franco and Otto Skorzeny, and so forth. And so Mr. Nixon gets involved in purloining his interest in Spain and helping the Trujillo, helping in quotes, the Trujillo daughters, Flora and Angelita Trujillo. The Generalissimo of the Dominican Republic has sent money before he's murdered, as I said before, into France, Spain, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. The fortune amassed by him in the Dominican Republic controlled 48 companies, auto distributorship, another auto distributor down in the Dominican, and here we have Mr. Charles Bluhdorn beginning as the auto parts distributor, along with, remember, the car parts of Bibi Rebozo, Richard Nixon's friend, and his entangling alliances. We won't digress too far into that. But owning the sugar mills and so forth, Trujillo had 60% of the Dominican sugar producing, which of course changes hands because he's offed by the CIA. But when he's offed, 150 million to 1 billion is over in Europe. It's in the name of one of his sons, Ramphis, R-A-M-F-I-S, and the father is very close to General Franco, and of course Otto Skorzeny is over there in the 50s, going back and forth from Argentina to Spain, distributing money to the Nazis who are released. By 1961, they're well on their way. John McCloy has let them out of the jail. Nixon got, according to Taub, $1.625 million just to get into the case. He didn't put any investment in, didn't pay for any the food, the travel, or anything, hardly did anything. But he's brought to a law firm in New York City, and immediately Trujillo is murdered by the CIA, and lo and behold, Richard Nixon is the attorney. He gets a lot of money. But it was in those 4 banks. Where did that money go? Whose hands did it get into? Between the Spanish connections of Franco, Trujillo, the 150 million to 1 billion. To answer that question and get back to Skorzeny, because this program began with the Boston Globe editorial on Otto Skorzeny. There's a book on Skorzeny called Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando. In case you don't know the spell the name or don't know the name, I use it so often. It's Skorzeny by Glenn Infield, published by St. Martin's Press in 1981. And he tells about Skorzeny, who got out of jail, and I'm going to just read a few paragraphs or sentences on the importance of Skorzeny because, as I say, the Boston Globe is using him in conjunction with the Nazis, the CIA, and the Galen operation, and this ties into the kind of operation of Mr. Bluhdorn or the major corporations, the J. Peter Grace Company, and so forth, carrying us right into the present confrontations, but using this money to put people into the position where they are very important, from export-import into multinational corporations. This book on Skorzeny said one man who knew the details of the money shipment of the Nazis and the valuables to Argentine by Martin Bormann, as well as the clandestine activities of the German industrialists, was Otto Skorzeny. He was waiting for the American military tribunal trials. He left the jail, and he knew where the money was camouflaged, along with Hjalmar Schacht, that was Hitler's banker, who was released by John J. McCloy. It didn't make Hjalmar Schacht very happy in 1947 when Evita Peron had a goodwill trip to Europe, because he was still in jail waiting the trial. Of course, he's to be released, but old Skorzeny is traveling around, and Evita Peron has gone to Europe, to Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and he's worried that the Spider, the Odessa associates, will give Evita a chance to release some of the cash out of her bank accounts, that she has it in these 40 banks, and so that they're worried that she may possibly get her fingers on that money, but she doesn't seem to parlay it for her own purposes. She has enough, $1 million in the Evita Peron Foundation down there in Argentina, and the Bormann money is kept intact. So Infield describes that Skorzeny was very smart. He's out of jail. It's 1949. He goes to Argentina. He knows the Bormann treasure is down there, a good hunk of it, and I think a hunk of it also was in the Dominican Republics. And he, of course, becomes immediately linked and entertained by Juan Peron and Evita Peron, and knows that she controls the bank. He knows it's in her account, and Evita is the woman, the brains behind all of this. Now, down there, Otto Skorzeny works with these various Nazis, and he teaches them, according to this book, he shows them how to torture people. He taught the secret police Nazi torture tactics that were proven effective in the Third Reich: electric prods to the genitals and the soles of the feet, whips, chains, and freezing water, the same devices used by the SS, the SD, and the Gestapo in Berlin, Dachau, Auschwitz, and other places during Hitler's reign. Now, this was written when Otto Skorzeny was teaching them in 1949 on. I cut out an article this last week in the LA Times, and maybe you saw it, and I'll quote it again, that they're using this torture in Chile right now. Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig and the Skorzeny Network, 1983, January and February, are using the electric prods where they tie them naked to these bedposts, these iron bedposts, and then use freezing water with electricity and put them into spasms and whips and chains, and hitting the soles of the feet and electrifying the genitals at the same time. 1983 in the press this week. You're reading about that if you read those papers. But Skorzeny was teaching them in 49, and by 1950, the Vatican, a Catholic priest, Reverend Guido Esperaza, Esparaza, a Catholic priest, tips off Skorzeny that he could have 1/4 of the Bormann treasure that will be funneled back to Madrid to be used by the Odessa and the Nazi groups. The Catholic priest tells him that Skorzeny wanted all of it, and Hjalmar Schacht knew the banking contacts. They knew that Evita had 40 numbered Swiss accounts, that they were left in her name. She had 30 million in diamonds. It was supposed to be 30 million in diamonds, several $100 million in 40 accounts. Her jewels were estimated at 30 million. That was the figure. There was delivered 20 million in one suitcase full of jewelry to a Zurich bank. She had the secret to the bank accounts. The time is running out for this broadcast, so I cannot go into where Evita's money went will continue next week, but we have to be vigilant of those people that came here, such as Mr. Charles Bluhdorn from Vienna, Peter Drucker, the father of the multinational corporations from Vienna, Fritz Kramer from Germany, and Mussolini's Italy, Helene vonDamm from Vienna. We have to examine more next week on go back to Evita Peron, finish that off, and go into how these corporations are formed and more about Gulf and Western with you. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell from Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week.